morning, everyone, and welcome to this roadshow. Obviously, we're sorry not to be with you in person. It seemed cautious to be planning these online in the autumn, but here we are, and unfortunately we can't be going round our usual Carfrey Mill, Perth, Aberdeen and Inverness. But I'm hoping some of our regular attendees are with us this morning. The roadshow series is a joint effort between FAS, AHDB and SRUC, and thank you all for logging in today. The sessions will be running, like I say, are intended to in some way replace our regular roadshow series. So picking up on some of the key themes that usually appear in the roadshows for you. So fungicide updates, variety updates, market updates, and soil health being key features. And they'll all follow a similar format to today in that we will have technical lectures, such as you've logged into just now, followed by a question and answer session and Ask the Expert session at 12:30. And then they'll be supported with downloads and podcasts. So there's lots of information that you can draw down, which I hope will give you the sort of technical information you would normally get. Today's session is a fungicide update and talk about integrated pest management. And my colleagues Neil Havis and Henry Christen are with me today. And Henry's going to start with a talk on a new IPM planning tool for you to use. So this is a new plan for Scotland, a tool for you to use to, for the first time, be able to measure what your IPM uptake is. And then I'll follow with a piece on wheat fungicides, and Neil will finish with a piece on the barley fungicides. Please type questions into the box that you'll see on your screens, and we'll take questions at the end. So we're hoping to have 5 or 10 minutes of short questions at the end. But there is that longer Ask the Expert question session at lunchtime at 12:30. So we'll hold over longer, more complex questions for that. So without further ado, we'll launch Henry's talk on IPM. Thank you.
Hello there, I'm Dr. Henry Christen of Scotland's Royal College, and today I'm going to talk to you a bit about a project that we had which attempted to measure adoption of integrated pest management practices on arable farms. So, IPM in the arable sector. What do we need to know? Well, when delving into the literature, we found there was very little information on adoption and even less on perception of IPM in the arable sector. Why do we need to know more? We need to know more so that we can establish baselines for the level of IPM currently being practiced and use those measures to identify any changes in IPM practice and also potentially identify some routes and barriers to IPM uptake. How do we get such information? Well, we decided that we needed a direct line to the growers, and the best way for us to get a lot of information was by way of a questionnaire. We developed a relatively short questionnaire of 24 questions and sent it out to farmers in England, Scotland, Ireland and Northern Ireland, and we got over 200 responses. We also developed a scoring system to quantify the level of IPM being practiced. So we pulled out some questions relating to IPM practice from the survey, and we used expert opinion, so largely advisors, but also farmers, agronomists, merchants, policymakers, so anyone really having significant influence over IPM decisions being made on farm. They collectively discussed the importance of IPM measures and gave them a weighting so that we'd end up having a scoring system out of 100. These are the 6 questions that we pulled out as relating to IPM practice. So the proportion of land in continuous cereals, the reasons for practicing an arable rotation, the influences on choice of crop variety, preventative measures, factors considered when developing an IPM plan, and whether or not they're a member of a discussion group. And you can see on the right the relative weights awarded to each of those questions. So around half of the overall IPM score concerns preventative measures, but within that you've got monitoring as well as some other sort of principles of IPM being covered. So we can look at the differences now in terms of IPM practice across the 4 study countries. So we have England, Scotland, Ireland, and Northern Ireland, and their IPM score along the y-axis, the vertical axis. As you'll see, England and Scotland, they both are statistically similar to each other. They both have high levels of IPM uptake compared to those in Northern Ireland, with the lowest scores typically being in Ireland. So what's driving those differences? We separated out the sample into those higher adopters, so the top quartile, the top 25% of the respondents, and the lower adopters, so the bottom 25% of the respondents. And we looked at the differences in terms of the scores they were getting for individual questions. Interestingly, one of the most significant findings was that high adopters of IPM consider many more factors when deciding on a pest management plan. So they're looking at information from previous seasons, local information in the area, and their knowledge of the fields, the types of varieties and the rotations they're employing, and how that might affect pests. So that's one of the more significant findings we have from that. So we know there are differences, and planning for for pest management being one of those significant differences between the high and low adopters. But what's driving their IPM score? When running the analysis, we found that the growers' perceived level of familiarity with IPM was a significant determinant of IPM score. So if they have the knowledge and they're familiar with IPM and its practices, they're more likely to uptake IPM practices, and as a result, get a higher IPM score. We also found that those that have a good relationship with their advisor have a higher score. Those that consider biological control methods as important components of IPM also have a higher IPM score. And those of a large farmed area have a higher IPM score as well. And we've talked about the country differences. So what we can see when looking at their IPM score on the vertical axis and the farmer's perceived level of familiarity with IPM. So this is the first question of the survey. How familiar are you with IPM on a 1 to 5 scale? And what you can see is that there is a significant relationship between those, between their familiarity and their IPM score. There's also a massive range with some farmers deeming themselves to be very unfamiliar with IPM, so scoring it on 1 or a 2, but they're actually, when looking at their IPM score, their level of adoption of IPM, they're actually scoring quite high. So that all those in the top left of the chart are not perceiving themselves to be very familiar with IPM, yet they are practicing IPM to a high level. So there could be some issue with the terminology there. Conversely, you'll also see in the bottom right of the chart, towards the bottom right, there'll be growers that are deeming themselves as being very familiar with IPM, but actually only practicing IPM to quite a low level. And that could be that there's other constraints. It could be market constraints, the location, the type of the farm, the size of the farm. There's all these sorts of things that could be constraining the amount of IPM practice, even though they've got the knowledge to do so. So if we can improve farmer knowledge, we can improve their familiarity with IPM and IPM practices, then that should be a valuable strategy going forward, which will allow us to improve IPM uptake overall. So when talking about knowledge, information source is obviously key. One of the questions we had was how valuable are the following information sources, and we asked them to rank their top 3. We found when considering pest management advice, those who are citing open days and crop walks, and also the agronomist as being significant sources of IPM advice, were more likely to be familiar with IPM, whereas those who rely more heavily on other farmers for IPM advice are perhaps less likely to be familiar with IPM. That could be because the farmers they're speaking to are perhaps not using the term IPM, even though they are referring to IPM practices such as rotation, variety choice, and things like that. But it could also be because farmers that are relying a lot on other farmers for their pest management advice, so quite often receiving expert advice secondhand. So perhaps the other farmer has been to an open day or spoken with their agronomist, and they're transferring that information to the farmer. Generally speaking, those that are actively seeking information, so those going out to the agronomists and the crop walks and open days and engaging with the IPM experts, are much more likely to be more familiar with IPM, and as a result, practice IPM to a higher level. So we can again look at the difference between the high IPM adopters, the top 25%, versus the low IPM adopters, the bottom 25% of the sample. And we can look at their information sources here. A few of the more significant differences are around the use of the agronomist. High adopters use an agronomist and have a better relationship with their agronomist, generally speaking. They're also more likely to rely on independent agronomist advice rather than a merchant agronomist. And there are various reasons for this. It could be that the higher adopters of a larger farmed area are part of a larger business. They can afford to buy in independent advice rather than somebody who's of a smaller enterprise that may be looking to just go to the one-stop shop, get some advice and get their products from the merchant at the same time. And that's generally what we see as well. So the lower IPM adopters put a much higher value on a merchant agronomist, and whereas the higher IPM adopters put a much higher value on the independent agronomist. And just one other thing on this chart, we'll see that the low IPM adopters are also more likely to cite passive sources of information. So just one way, transfer of knowledge from Farming Press, for example, as one of their top IPM advice sources, whereas this was much less likely for the higher adopters of IPM. How do we increase IPM adoption? Well, within this study, we found that all farmers had adopted IPM to some extent. The high adopters had a larger farmed area, and they were more familiar with IPM. They had a good relationship with their advisor, and were particularly good at planning for IPM and considering all the factors that might affect their pest management plan. The high adopters are those that are actively seeking IPM knowledge. We must make sure that IPM advice is clear, consistent, and evidence-based. And another thing that we must make sure is that the responsibility is not all solely placed on the farmer. It's the responsibility across the supply chain to ensure that IPM is being adopted. There are certain barriers that exist within the supply chain regarding certain use of certain varieties or certain quality parameters that are perhaps relatively irrelevant, which are enforced on the grower and really restrict their options in terms of IPM. We must look to try to overcome some of those barriers, and it does require a coordinated effort to do that. We are now in a situation where our IPM plan has been adopted by the NFU and the NFUS and the NFUS and the voluntary initiative, and a modified version of our survey is now online at the Plant Health Centre website. So I would encourage all growers to visit the website, complete the IPM plan, and that will count as your plan completed for quality assurance schemes, whether that be Scottish Quality Crops or Red Tractor. By completing these plans, you'll get your score, you'll get a little bit of feedback, and then hopefully year on year, you'll see gradual improvement to your score, but also the other advantages we see of improved IPM practices on farm. Better profitability and also environmental stewardship as well.
Thanks, Henry. And I think there's lots for us to learn from there in terms of how we can help with our planning around IPM. So hopefully we'll get some questions on that. We'll move straight into the fungicide choices for winter wheat. So this is a presentation that I've put together to cover that. Thanks, Gemma. Thank you for joining this session on fungicide challenges and choices in wheat for 2021. I'm Fiona Burnett, Professor of Applied Plant Pathology at SRUC, where I'm also Head of Knowledge Exchange and Impact. So what I want to do is give you an update on our 2020 wheat trials. and to start to think about how we can apply some of the principles of integrated pest management to our wheat programme. So to give you some context on the trials from last year, they followed that difficult autumn and the very dry spring, which lowered disease pressure. And, that was typical of, for many of you in commercial practice. And the trials were done against that backdrop of pesticide withdrawals and the pressure to meet net zero targets and responsibilities towards the environment and biodiversity, and to start to explore how we can optimise our fungicide programmes and reduce inputs with more confidence. And in addition, how we can manage resistance issues. And within that, the inclusion of multi-sites remains a key feature of more sustainable resistance management practices. The exceptionally dry spring illustrated on this slide really shows you how April and May were well below rainfall averages. And then typically the Scottish summer resumed and we see the wetter June there. And the trial series that I want to talk about today was done with NIAB and ADAS, and you see the trial sites marked on the chart here on our own site in East Lothian. And this trial series was done to try and pull out that type of information about the scenarios where fungicide rates can be lowered with more confidence, where, clearly seasonal and site differences are one of the reasons that we sometimes struggle to reduce them with confidence. Our trial site last year was in East Lothian, and the pictures here are probably sadly familiar to many of you. So the earlier drilled part of the trial, you see there, very wet. The plants are there, but growth is very slow. But the later drilled trial, even 8 weeks after drilling, there are still no plants there. So that was the backdrop to the 2020 season trials. And this series was really exploring the two different drilling dates and then the power of different varietal resistances as drivers of disease, and then layering on the degree of fungicide inputs, so low, moderate, or high. And we varied the inputs per season, but they were fairly realistic in commercial practice, although they varied over seasons. Perhaps more encouragingly, what you see is that by the time we got to harvest, that apparently bald late drilled area of the trial had recovered remarkably. So average yields there of just below 10 tonnes a hectare compared to the 10.7 for the earlier drilled site, which shows the power of wheat to recover. So the data I want to talk through, if we look at the data from last season as an example, you see there 3 different varieties, elation, illicit, and firefly, so representing susceptible, moderate, and resistant wheat varieties, different levels of input there, low, medium, or high fungicides, and then the early or the late drilled plots. So you can see immediately later drilled on the right of the chart, lower levels of septoria in the crop. And similarly, you can see the power of the varietal resistance in just reducing the level of disease in the crop. And you do see the increasing fungicide programs reducing the disease levels there. But you can see that if you take the elation in the early drilled slot, the higher scenario, you can see how much the high input fungicides are reducing disease there. But it's commensurately less in those lower risk scenarios. So again, if you look at firefly, resistant variety in a late drilled scenario, disease levels are lower anyway, and the fungicides are adding commensurately less. Just some pictures to illustrate that. So again, you see the early drilled versus the late drilled plots and the amount of septoria. Bearing in mind last season was not a high pressure season. You see it beginning to build there when these pictures were taken in June. And where we're going with this trial series, if you then look at the 22 sites over the different seasons of the trial, so 5 seasons in total, you can see there the output value per hectare when you look at those input programs. There are additional slides to support this if you look at the downloads from this session. You see there, again, if we look at a susceptible variety in a high-risk early drilled scenario, you can see that the low, medium and high fungicide programs are adding to the yield, the output value in that scenario. If you, again, you look at the right hand of the chart, where you look at a resistant variety in a late drilled scenario, you can see that the difference between the low, moderate and high input programs is much less. And if we start to convert that to a table, which may or may not be easier to digest, what we're doing here is actually attaching a value to that added input from the low, medium or high fungicide programs. And if you look at the top of the chart there, what we've done is we've meaned the two different sowing dates, but if you look at the susceptible varieties versus the resistant, you can see that in the high input fungicide program, it's adding £41 to the value of the medium input program. It's adding only £8 if you go to a resistant variety. And if you drop to the bottom of the chart there and you look at later drilling and a moderately resistant variety, you can see that that high input program is adding nothing in terms of output value compared to your moderate program. Now, these values are before the deduction of fungicide costs, and that's because we've lost chlorothalonil, which was so cheap and so effective. It doesn't make that a very useful sum for you now. But what you can do with this table is then think about your own costs. You know what your own input costs for fungicides are. So if a medium input program is adding 33 tonnes for you in a late drilled, moderately resistant variety, then you might think that sum is worth doing. But you can begin to compare that actually if the added cost of a high input program is, you know, £40, £20, and actually you're getting nothing back, then you can genuinely make those savings and be reassured that there is the building confidence in those situations where you can usefully reduce your inputs. Now, one of the most effective ways to get value from your fungicides is simply to use the most effective ones available. You're very familiar with the fungicide performance curve. So here we see Septoria eradicant data from 2020, and you see on the right hand there the efficacy of Proline and the SDHI in an eradicant situation. And you see the improvement in efficacy where you use those front-running SDHI azole mixes with Revastar falling slightly ahead of the previous best, Ascra X Pro there. To point out there as well that you can use two different azoles in those two different programs. So we can begin to diversify prothioconazole and Revasol and bring a diversity of azoles into programs. As ever, if we look at last year's data, protectant activity is much better against Septoria than that eradicant activity. And you see the curves begin to pull down. But again, you see the mixed products performing better than the straight products. And you see there Arizona full pit at full dose, giving you a reference point for how it performed in the trials last year. And there are the yields building over the last 3 seasons. So again, you see those newer products pulled to the front of the pack, and you see the increased yield benefit from mixture products. The declines in azole efficacy over the years do give cause for concern. This gives you an update from 2020, where clearly we've lost epoxyconazole, but you see where prothioconazole has sat for the last couple of years in terms of percentage control relative to previous years. And perhaps some evidence of a stabilisation there, maybe reflecting the fact that we're using more and stronger SDHIs and programmes to prop them up. A health warning attached to that though, because when we begin to look at SDHI efficacy, again, the data from 2020 builds on previous stories where we knew that they were beginning to show a variability between sites. This chart shows you the average activity over a run of years from 2015 with the most effective control at a fungicide performance site compared to the poorest control as those dotted lines. So you see that increased variability in performance. You do see that, 2020, because of the lower disease pressure, the efficacy was relatively good, but you still see that range in efficacy between sites. A positive message from that, though, comes when we start to look at the mixture products. But the concern over SDHI sensitivity continues to build. The data from Bart Fry at NIAB and Rothamsted begins to show you again for the 2020 that drift in SDHI sensitivity to SDHIs. And you can see that the sensitive part of the population is again lost, and there's a move to the right-hand part of the chart there, which is not welcome. And the pie chart shows you again the building diversity of mutations that are starting to be recorded. So the concerns over SDHIs continue to be a live issue for us. But yeah, the positive message about SDHI and azole mixes, so you see the protectant activity over time for those mixture products. It's tilting as the SDHI charts were doing, but actually when you look at the newer products there, the Revistar and the azole, you see that they have brought us back to a good position in terms of efficacy for the 2020 data. So again, the win-win there in a balanced mixture. Thinking about how we retain efficacy in our new and existing chemistry, we know the story about using low-risk multi-site fungicides as mixtures and using the minimum effective balance dose that we can to try and limit the pressures on fungicide. Fusarium at T3 is a major consideration for us, particularly in wet summers. And here you see two different azole options. So you've got Solel and you've got Proline there with very comparable efficacy and interestingly similar levels of dawn control. And what you see here is Mancozeb in Unizeb Gold there, giving some control of the head disease symptoms. So as an option for T3, it's there, but do please keep checking on that final use update. Good choice of control options for yellow rust where you're applying them protectantly. So on the right hand there, you see SDHI, Strobilurin and azole options. And again, you see the different mixture products on the left hand of the chart there with an option there of Alatus era, which tends to come to the front when it comes to yellow rust control. So pulling that together into conclusions, you have, the SDHI azole mixes continuing to give good levels of control. And as an example of that, Revistar being substantially better than Imtrex alone. The concern over SDHI sensitivity is real, and we do need to think about how we use multi-sites and programs to protect them and to add to efficacy and yield. As in previous years, we're thinking hard about targeting the most effective products at the most responsive timings. And if we do get new chemistry next year in the form of Inatrec, which wasn't here in time to include in the fungicide performance charts there, it does give you an option to diversify programs. And it includes a further option to genuinely mix things up for next year. Mixing your azoles, alternating your azoles is a smaller tool when it comes to resistance management, is probably useful though in addition, and multi-sites remaining strong. So the take-home messages from that, really tailor your fungicides to the risk and think again about the scope to reduce your inputs in those later sown and more resistant varieties where we know that the risk is lower, and the data presented today, which you can digest at your leisure, will give you some facts and figures around the cost benefits of going into higher rate programs. Keep your diversity in programs there and use mixes to help. And we know that those multi-sites will add to your efficacy and help with resistance management. Try and keep them in at all timings where you can. And again, a key message there, just building your fungicide programs around those key timings, but then adjusting them as you go through the season, depending on what you're seeing as you crop walk and as you take evidence from other sources and crop monitoring and so on. So thank you for listening, and please do look at the downloads in addition to the presentation. Thank you. Thanks. Gosh, it's a horrible experience listening to myself give a lecture. I feel for you all over the years. An interesting question here on that about whether that type of table showing responses to high, medium and low input programs would be a useful tool to encourage IPM adoption. And absolutely, the idea of that type of work is to build confidence in the situations where you can reduce inputs, but still, maintain yield and profit. So that's exactly the type of information that we would hope would encourage IPM uptake. So we'll move on to Neil's presentation now on barley, and then take the rest of the questions after Neil's finished speaking. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Neil Havis. I'm a senior lecturer in the Carbon Crop and Soil team in the Agriculture, Horticulture and Engineering and Sciences department at SRUC, and I'd like to talk to you this morning about fungicide challenges and choices in barley, looking ahead to 2021. What can we expect to see and how can we plan for the year ahead? Okay, so I'll start briefly by giving you an update on the 2020 trials. So we came off, this time last year, we were coming off the back of a very wet autumn and a very wet winter, and that made crop establishment for many winter barley crops quite difficult. Those which did manage to get established fared quite well, but then of course we were hit by a very unusually dry spring and that lowered disease pressure. The spring crops were sown into dry worm seed beds with low disease pressure at many sites. Thinking about going forward, how can we manage disease and maintain yield input with reduced input options? And also, how can we manage potential resistance issues in barley crops? And I'd like to also mention today briefly what other IPM measures we can think about integrating into barley production systems. Well, I don't need to tell you that 2020 was a year unlike any other. But it was also a very unusual year in terms of the weather conditions that the crops had to face. So, as I mentioned before, looking back at the winter, if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, this is the actual rainfall amount in terms of millimeters that the UK experienced in the winter of 2020. And you can see there's lots of browns down the east coast, but there's a lot of blue, which shows very high levels over a meter of rainfall on the west of the country. That's in 1 year, but if you look to the graph on the right, you can see how the year compares with the 30-year average from 1981 to 2010. And there's a lot more blues, and the whites and blues indicate that we had above average rainfall. So very wet conditions for the crop, and in terms of establishing disease, that was good for establishing splashborne pathogens like rincusporium in the winter barley crop early on in the growing season. We move on into spring. If you look on the graph on the left, here's the actual rainfall amount, and you can see in comparison to the winter there's a lot more browns, so you can see in a lot of cases we're down below 100 millimeters for the spring, so that's covering a number of months and that's very little rainfall. And if you compare that on the graph on the right hand side to again the 30-year average, and you can see there's a lot of browns. There's not many whites, there's not many areas in the UK where we were at a normal kind of rainfall for spring. In most cases we were well below, and in some cases only 50% below the normal rainfall. So that had a significant effect on crop growth and also disease development. Okay, we went from that very dry spring into summer. On the left hand side you can see the rainfall amounts for summer 2020. a lot more whites and blues starting to appear on the graph. Again, a majority of the cereal growing areas are showing up brown. But if you look to the graph on the right, again, this compares with a 30-year average, and you can see there's a lot more whites and blues in there. And the darker the blue, that indicates the higher above the average rainfall we were getting for summer. So you can see some parts of Western Scotland 150% the normal rainfall. So we paid for that dry spring with a lot more rain in the summer. And again, that had an effect on crop growth and disease development. Okay, so briefly I'd like to talk in a bit more detail about some of the winter barley trials. Our trial site at Lanark, you saw in one of the earlier pictures, we had good crop establishment, there was some disease development. We went 8 weeks at this trial site without significant rainfall. So that has a significant effect on the crop. You can see on this image here, we had a lot of the secondary tillers were aborted, so there was a lot of white heads in the crop, and it almost looked as if we had the crop at two different levels. So you had one level of ears where stem extension taking place, and then some of the secondary tillers were far more stunted. So very uneven in terms of crop development. So the rincusporium that had established early on in the growing season was checked by that very dry spell in the spring, and although disease levels did start to come back in later on, they barely hit a significant level until late on in the summer. We did have some mildew in the trials, but in terms of other diseases, this was certainly not the year for ramularia. It was too dry. Those conditions did not favour the growth of the fungal pathogen at all. So I'd like to cover briefly some of the fungicide performance work sponsored by the HDB. So there are a number of trials done this year looking at rincusporium or in a number of situations, both in terms of mixed or eradicant. There was a trial set up to look at net blotch. There was a net blotch trial also, which was then used for mildew data collection, and there was no significant ramularia observed in Scottish trials this year, so data was taken from a ramularia trial in Chuggas in the south of Ireland. But again here, no significant disease. But there was some disease data, and I'll just go through the graphs briefly with you just now. So looking back at rincusporium control in the eradicant situation, this is data from 2 trials. You can see on the left hand side we've got the data from Revistar XE, and you can see significant and good control by Revistar. So by 50% of the full label dose, your controls is nearly 90 to 95%. Very significant. Compare that on the right with the straight product. So you've got Proline on its own, slightly underperforming against the Revistar, and then you've got Imtrex. So you can see Imtrex still looks good against rincusporium in an eradicant situation. Okay, in the mixed trial, this is data from 1 trial only. Again, we've got Revistar XE, and you can see again you're getting good control from Revistar. So half a full label dose is reducing disease levels from 16% to around about 2% in the crop. On the right hand side, you can see in this higher pressure situation here there's a clearer differentiation between the Imtrex and the Proline. So here the SDHI is doing a far better job in controlling rincusporium in this situation than the azole prothioconazole. Okay, what about in a protectant situation? Here's data from 6 trials from 2018 to 19, and here we've got Siltra X Pro on the left hand side, and again you can see in this protectant situation it's giving you good control. If you compare that with the straight products in the graph on the right, Imtrex probably slightly just ahead, and here Proline seem to be doing a reasonable job as well. So we'll see a bit more about what that means in terms of fungicide choice later on. In terms of net blotch in a protectant situation, here's the data from 2 trials in 2018 to 19. There was no data from 2020, but from 2018 to 19, you can see you've got the options here. So the prothioconazole and the Imtrex, so the azole and the sdhi option, given good control up to 50% of the full label dose. You're reducing disease levels from 15 to below 2%, which is good. Here's kayak, so here's the strobilurin option, and again you can see it's well behind in terms of protection against net blotch. So ramularia, as I said, 2020 was not the year for ramularia disease development. Looking back at the data we have from 2019, where we had one winter and one spring barley trial, you can see the Revistar XE is the most effective fungicide we have in terms of controlling ramularia. What we were surprised to see in 2019 was some reasonable activity from prothioconazole. Okay, so I said these are the results from the fungicide performance trials. We had one winter barley trial at SRUC's trial site in Bog Hall, looking at control of ramularia, and here we are putting a cover spray on to control other diseases, and then we were applying different fungicides at the T2 timing, and we're looking here at ramularia disease levels on leaf F-1. Now late in the season, unfortunately the untreated plots had senesced, but you can see from this blue line, which is ramularia disease severity on leaf F-1, you can see we're getting some activity in terms of ramularia control from a number of fungicides, even Comet, Cyflamid, Folpit, the Imtrex, Cumulus is sulfur. You can see prothioconazole, if anything, is doing a worse job in controlling ramularia than the other fungicides. There's a Revistar, which you can see is one of the better products that we have. Okay, so just to reinforce, we are seeing some activity from some fungicides. We had hoped to do more trials in 2020, but with the impact of COVID, it was difficult to get spring barley data, and again there was very little disease out there. So something to look at again in 2021 and be aware of. Revistar is probably still your safest and most secure option if conditions look like they're going to favour ramularia. Okay, briefly some slides. We did see some ramularia in one of the recommended list trials. This was in Fife. People always ask about the potential for genetic control. The Braemar is a very susceptible variety of spring barley against ramularia. I just wanted to put some pictures in to show you what kind of genetic levels of control we're at the moment. So you can see there's a lot of ramularia spots in that crop of Braemar. These are a couple of modern varieties. Fairway is a feed variety, and you can see not complete control, but there is a significant reduction in terms of ramularia symptoms. And as well, here's the picture from Sienna as well. So you can see there is still some ramularia present, but nowhere near to the extent of Braemar. So hopefully in the future we'll see some varieties coming through which will give an even better differentiation between them in terms of ramularia resistance, and hopefully the resistance ratings will be able to calculate it again. So in summary then, briefly about barley, we've shown the Imtrex is more effective than Proline against Rinco in 2020. That Revistar XE is showing good protecting and eradicative activity in 2020 against Rinco, similar levels to the Imtrex. The Revistar XE, similar activity against net blotch to Imprex and Proline in 2020. Proline and Imtrex themselves highly effective protectants against net blotch in 2018 and 19. And again, for ramularia control, Revistar XE is your best option, but there might still be some activity from the Proline, as we saw in the previous graphs. Okay, so to finish off, I'd like to present some of the data which has been generated from trials by my colleague, Dr. Henry Chryson. And Henry's been looking at the effects of sow date and variety and fungicide use in winter barley crops to see if we can if we can make the most of varietal resistance in terms of choosing our fungicide program. And he's been looking at two varieties of winter barley. Surge, which is more resistant, has a resistance rating to rincusporium of 7, against KWS Tower, which has a resistance rating to rincusporium of 6. He looked at 4 different fungicide programs, basically going from high, medium and low inputs against an untreated. And he's been looking at a number of trials over a number of years. And this is a summary graph looking at the data from Edinburgh over the 3 years. So you can see on the y-axis we've got yield in tons per hectare. We've got surge, sown early and late, tower, sown early and late. And you can see in general, the general conclusion would this be, we see the greater fungicide response in the early sown crops, so you can see greater difference between the untreated and the fungicide treated than we do in the late sown crops. So there's more of a difference here and here than there is between these group of plots here and here. Okay, and in terms of what does that mean, or why is that coming through, when Henry looked in more detail, he looked at ramularia on the F-1 leaf layer, and here he's comparing early sown and late sown. So here you've got untreated against a 2-spray program, and you can see far better disease control or lower disease levels where you have an early sown crop and a 2-spray program. And you can see early sown, higher disease, late sown, lower disease, lower disease. So ramularia wasn't the only disease we saw in these trials. There was also a lot of tan spot present in 2019, and again we saw something similar. So here you've got early sown and early sown tower, higher disease levels. If you compare that with the late sown, we get lower disease levels in the crop. So that's something to think about if you're planning your winter barley crop and thinking about sowing date and what effect that's going to have on your stewardship of the crop going forward. So in general, the later the sown, the higher potential risk for disease. Okay, so Henry's been able to look into these in more detail. He's looked at green leaf area retention, and this is basically across the 3 years, so you can see 2018, 2019, 2020. And here we've got the 2 varieties sown early late. And it's noticeable to look in terms of green leaf area retention. The early sown in 2019, you can see having reduced green leaf area, big differences between the fungicides and the untreated, less on the late sown crops, more green leaf area. And here 2020, a similar story. The earlier sown crops were senescing more rapidly, even when they've had high fungicide inputs. And the conclusion from these trials is that earlier senescence is likely due to the spring droughts that we talked about earlier in the presentation. Okay. So in terms of fungicide inputs, in 2020 a T1 was probably sufficient, but in the other years the multiple spray programs were worth the investment, especially in 2019 when we had that higher pressure from the diseases tan spot and ramularia. Okay, so that's flag leaf retention, and you can see just highlighting that point. Look at that year and that drop in terms of green leaf area retention. If we then look at yield, which is of course the important thing we're interested in, if you look at 2018, 2019 and 2020, okay, 2020 was a very different year, so there was little benefit from the fungicides because the dry weather around that stem extension stopped disease development, and especially rincusporium, which would have been most damaging to yield. In 2020 we did see the earlier sown crops out yielding the later sown crops, possibly because they were further along, more developed, and were closer to setting yield potential when that droughted period did come in. You can see that's quite a significant difference. If you look at it compared with the other years, there's far less of an impact of delaying sowing in 2018 and 2019. Here the biggest change is relating to the fungicide program, but in 2020 early sown crops definitely had an advantage. Okay, and briefly want to mention another set of work that Henry has going. So this is some Means of Lauriston funded work, And here he's looking at the effects of tillage against variety against fungicide input. So in conjunction with the James Hutton Institute, we have a number of trials set up, and here we're comparing direct drilling of winter barley crops against a ploughed situation. Again, looking at two varieties. Surge is chosen as our resistant variety, KWS Tower is susceptible. Again, we'll put on top of that 4 fungicide programs, either untreated, low, medium and high inputs. And there's 2 sites chosen for this project, Jury Farm in Leven and Milnfield near Dundee. And the idea is this project will run over 3 years, and we'll get some definitive empirical data about the effects of tillage and variety and fungicide on winter barley production in terms of yield and disease development. Okay, so just the take-home actions from my talk today. It's important to think about walking the crops regularly to monitor disease pressure. Think about lowering fungicide rates in low pressure situations. We've talked about that in previous years. If there's very little disease pressure, can you think about cutting back? Use products that we do have, and there's fewer and fewer of them, but hopefully more to come. Use them in balanced programs. It's important to protect that new chemistry that we do have, so the Revistar. Think carefully about the addition of multisites, and we're talking about Fulpit now with chlorothalonil gone, and it looks like mancozeb going. So Fulpit is a good idea to protect that new chemistry. And think about other options you can incorporate to manage disease and hopefully protect the yield, especially in feed barley crops, where you can play about with other inputs as well. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Neil. And that brings us on to some of the good questions that have come through in the chat there. So maybe just to follow up on your one there was a question about the Revistar cutoff on malting crops. Now, obviously, the trials were done, so the activity you see in those charts is Revistar used within the recommended cutoff. But do you want to say a little bit about the timings?
So the fungicide performance graphs, the protocol is 45 to 49, which is the timing that we recommend, which would still get you in time for cut off for malting crops. In terms of early activity, all the trials we've done on fungicides looking at ramularia control show the later that you go, the better for disease control, but obviously there's a cut-off point for all fungicides. So I think I'm happy with the 45 to 49. Going earlier won't give the same level of control, I don't think, as a 45 to 49 timing.
Yeah. So maybe that feeling that, you know, if Revistar brings slightly better efficacy than Proline, there is still retained efficacy there. So perhaps for the moderate crops, there's more flexibility in that timing. Okay, thanks, Neil. Henry, there was a question about the barriers that you referred to for uptake of IPM that come from the supply chain. So I suspect there you were thinking primarily of, you know, the examples around malting varieties. But do you want to expand on that?
Well, myself and social scientists at SIUC, such people like Elliot Medder, conducted a few workshops with stakeholders, predominantly farmers and agronomists, to try to identify some of the areas in which the decisions that are available to them have been restricted. So you brought up the potential restrictions for malting barley, and that's the maltsters are looking for 1 or 2 different varieties. So you're taking a lot of the decisions, which is a major decision, variety choice, out of the farmer's hands. But the same can be said of the potato sector as well, where a lot more of the sort of barriers and the pressure is coming from the supermarkets. So the consumer via the supermarkets is denoting what varieties and what specs are being required as well. There's work going on at the moment to try to look to ways in which marketing and can actually be used to attract premiums for IPM approaches to farming. Again, it's not just the farmers, the processors, the retailers, it's all that need to be in alignment. Otherwise, a barrier will be in effect. So there are various ways we can look to overcome some of these barriers. And I think by working with others in the supply chain, we can hopefully look at some of these potential barriers and ways. Do they actually exist, or are they necessary in the supply chain? And if they are, what alternatives do we have to sort of circumvent them to increase the level of IPM uptake overall? But it's particularly a problem when looking in the horticultural sector, where, as people know, so superficial damage to produce can mean that it's not sold at all, or a much lower price is attracted to it. So some awareness, again, there's been lots of people trying to do this, TV chefs and that, trying to make an issue about the amount of food waste that goes on for purely cosmetic reasons. So a lot of work needs to be done. Luckily, there's a small DEFRA project at the moment looking at ways that we can take advantage of marketing and supply of information to the public about IPM and sustainably produced food. So hopefully that'll start to get a bit of traction, and we can go from there.
Thanks, Henry. We just got a couple of minutes. I'll try and rattle through a few of the other quick questions. There was one about continued declines in SDHI chemistry against Septoria. So broadly, yes, we would expect declines to continue. The decline's not been as dramatic as we feared, probably because we are supporting it with other chemistry. We are still very supportive of the use of remaining multi-sites to manage Septoria and reduce the pressure on the azoles and SDHIs. If and when we lose those, yes, there's an enhanced risk to the SDHIs, but on the plus side, you know, we're anticipating some new chemistry coming, so keeping that diversity in programmes is really important. But I think that's quite a big subject, and one we'll certainly come back to at the Ask the Expert session at 12:30, just to plug that one again. Neil, there was a question there, it's quite interesting. How do you explain the low green leaf area in the winter barleys, but the fact that we got quite high yields? Does that reflect, you know, the...
Yeah, I mean, I'll have a go at this, and then Henry might like to comment. I would think that the potential for any barley crop is set early on, and the fact that those early sown crops had good potential and the green leaf retention was long enough for grain fill to take place. I mean, that's my understanding. But Henry, it was your trial. You'd like to comment?
Totally agree with you, and I'd say probably if you were looking at wheat, that wouldn't be true, because we know that the flag leaf contributes a lot more to yield than it does in barley crops. So yeah, that's fair.
Okay, right. Thanks.
That's great. That brings us to 11 o'clock, so precision cheering almost. Please do come to the expanded session at 12:30, where we can pick out some of the points. There was a nice point in the chat there about using the wheat input table in an interactive way. So that's certainly one that I'll pick up. We're in the process of writing up that project, so that's a nice idea. Thank you all for attending this morning. I hope you're all safe and well at home there. So thanks to everybody for this morning's session, and hopefully see you all soon.